In the unforgiving glare of the Texas sun, where the dust settles on everything, including secrets, a lone woman walks. She is heavily pregnant, hauling water for miles just to survive another day. Her past is a ghost. She's trying to outrun her future, as barren as the land around her. Then a man appears. He's not a savior. He's a king in this desolate land, a wealthy rancher with an offer that sounds more like a contract than a proposal. He offers her his name and his home. But at what cost? This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of a desperate bargain that unearths a violent past and forges an unbreakable bond in the crucible of the Wild West. The sun was a merciless hammer over the plains of West Texas. It beat down on Elara's back, the heat radiating from the cracked earth through the worn soles of her boots. Every step was a negotiation with pain. The two wooden buckets, sloshing with precious water, felt heavier with each yard. She covered their wire handles, digging into her calloused palms, but the weight in her hands was nothing compared to the deep aching weight in her belly. The baby. A life she had to protect, a life that was both her reason to keep walking and the very thing making each step an agony. She was 5, maybe 6 miles from Blackwood Creek, the only reliable water source for settlers too poor or too transient to have a well of their own. For Elara, it was a daily pilgrimage, a ritual of survival. She'd left the ramshackle tent she called home before dawn, and now, with the sun at its zenith, she was only halfway back. Her world had shrunk to this dusty track, to the rhythm of her own breathing and the slosh of water that meant life. Other women from the collection of tents and shacks, known derisively as Scraptown, sometimes made the journey with her, their chatter a brief distraction from the toil. But not today. Today she was alone, and the silence was a vast, empty canvas for her fears. The baby was her secret, a truth she had guarded ferociously since she'd fled her old life 1,000 miles to the east. Here she was, just another desperate soul. No one knew the name Eliza Gable, the woman who had disappeared from a life of polite, suffocating violence in Missouri. Here, she was simply Elara, a widow. It was a lie, but it was a shield. Her husband Silas was a man whose charm was as brilliant and as dangerous as a flash flood. He could sweet-talk a bird from a tree and then wring its neck without a second thought. When his business dealings turned dark and a Pinkerton agent ended up dead on his doorstep, she had seen her only chance. With Silas imprisoned and awaiting the gallows, she had packed a single bag, taken what little money she could find, and vanished. She'd read in a tattered, week-old newspaper that he had been hanged. She had to believe it. Believing Silas was dead was as essential as the water in her buckets. A sudden dizziness washed over her. The horizon shimmered, the blue sky bleaching to a blinding white. She stumbled, and a sickening slosh of water escaped one bucket, darkening the dust at her feet. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the heat. She couldn't afford to lose a single drop. Gritting her teeth, she steadied herself, her hand instinctively going to her swollen belly. Not yet. She whispered a prayer to her own body. Just a little further. It was then that she heard it, the steady, powerful rhythm of a horse's hooves. It wasn't the sound of a tired farm nag. This was a sound of purpose, of strength. A rider was approaching from the west, a silhouette, growing larger against the sun-blasted landscape. Fear, a familiar companion, coiled in her gut. A lone woman was a target, a pregnant one even more so. She lowered her buckets, her knuckles white, and tried to make herself look small, insignificant. The horse was a magnificent black stallion, and the man who rode it seemed carved from the same imposing mold. He wore a fine dark duster, coated in a layer of pale dust, and a black Stetson that shadowed a face of sharp angles and severe lines. He reined in the horse a dozen feet away, the animal snorting impatiently, its hide gleaming with sweat. The man didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze sweeping from her face, down to the telltale swell of her stomach, to the spilled water, darkening the ground. His eyes, the color of flint, missed nothing. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was no drifter. The leather of his saddle was tooled, the rifle in his scabbard was a high-quality repeater, and his entire bearing screamed of wealth and command. She knew who he was. Every settler knew of Caleb Thorne. His ranch, the Thorne Crest, was the largest in the county, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that choked out smaller homesteads. He was a legend, a recluse, a man spoken of, in whispers, as being as hard and unforgiving as the land he'd conquered. "That's a long walk for a woman in your condition," he finally said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of sympathy. It was a statement of fact. "I manage," Elara replied, her own voice raspy from thirst and disuse. She hated the weakness in it. He swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered and solid. He walked closer, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He stopped at the dark patch of spilled water. "You're losing your pay for the day's work," he observed. Elara bristled. "It's my own water, and your own child you're putting at risk to fetch it," he countered, his gaze locking onto hers. It was an unnervingly direct stare, as if he were trying to read the ledger of her life. "I've seen you on this track before. Every day, rain or shine." She said nothing. Admitting her desperation to this man felt like a surrender she wasn't willing to make. He took another step now, towering over her. "What's your name?" "Elara," she said, omitting a surname she didn't have. "Elara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "My name is Caleb Thorne." As if she didn't know. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, is getting on in years. I need someone for general duties at the ranch house, cooking, cleaning. The work is indoors. You'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day. I'll pay you a fair wage." Elara stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate surge of hope. A job, a real roof. It was more than she had dared to dream of. But men like Caleb Thorne didn't offer charity. There was always a price. "Why me?" "Because you're desperate, and desperation breeds reliability." He said the words blunt and without malice. "And because I don't abide seeing a child endangered by foolish pride." The insult stung, but the truth of it was undeniable. She was putting her baby at risk, every single day. The long walk, the poor nutrition, the constant stress, it was a gamble, and the stakes were her child's life. I accept, she said the words, feeling momentous. "Good," he nodded, his expression unchanging. "There's a wagon coming down this road in an hour. It'll have my supplies from town. The driver knows to look for you. He will take you and your things to the ranch." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tell me, Elara, are you a widow?" The question was a physical blow. The lie felt thick and heavy on her tongue. "Yes, my husband died in a railroad accident back east." It was a story she had rehearsed, a fiction, polished by fear. Caleb Thorne watched her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. She felt stripped bare, certain he could see the lie hanging in the air between them. But he simply gave a short, sharp nod. "The wagon will be here soon. Don't be late." Without another word, He turned, swung himself back onto his stallion, and galloped away, leaving her standing in a cloud of dust, with 2 buckets of water and a future that had just been violently rewritten. The relief was so profound. It almost brought her to her knees. But as she watched him disappear over the horizon, a new kind of fear began to creep in. She had escaped one cage, only to wonder if she had just willingly walked into another one with gilded bars and a far more powerful keeper. The Thorncrest Ranch wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the valley, a 2-story structure of dark timber and river stone, formidable and imposing. It was surrounded by manicured lawns, an impossible splash of green in the parched landscape, watered by a massive cistern that was, Elara noted with a bitter irony, larger than her entire dwelling in Scraptown. As the supply wagon rattled up the long, winding drive, she felt herself shrinking, the worn fabric of her dress a stark testament to her poverty in the face of such calculated wealth. She was met at the door not by Caleb Thorne, but by a woman whose posture was as stiff and unyielding as a fence post. She was older, with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun, and eyes the color of a winter sky. "I am Mrs. Gable," the woman announced, her voice thin and sharp. "Mr. Thorne has informed me of your employment." She looked Elara up and down, her gaze lingering on the swell of her belly with undisguised disapproval. "You will sleep in the servants' quarters at the back. Your duties will begin at 5 tomorrow morning. Dinner is at 6 this evening. Do not be late." There was no welcome, no kindness. Elara was not a guest. She was a component, a new piece of machinery to be slotted into the workings of the ranch. The room she was given was small and Spartan, but it was clean. It had a real bed, with a thick quilt, a washstand, with a pitcher of fresh water, and a small window that looked out onto a vegetable garden. Compared to her tent, it was a palace. After months of sleeping on a bedroll on the hard ground, the softness of the mattress felt like an impossible luxury. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wept. They were tears of relief, exhaustion, and a profound, disorienting fear. The following weeks settled into a monotonous rhythm. Elara's life was dictated by bells, a bell for waking, a bell for meals, a bell for the end of the workday. She cleaned, she mended linens, she helped in the cavernous kitchen, her hands growing soft from soap and water instead of rough from dirt and wire handles. The physical toil was less grueling than hauling water, but it was replaced by a different kind of exhaustion, the constant draining weight of Mrs. Gable's scrutiny. The housekeeper watched her every move, her disapproval a silent, oppressive presence. She would run a finger over a surface Elara had just dusted, check the seams of a shirt she had just mended, her silence more damning than any criticism. Elara knew she was seen as an interloper, a charity case, and worse, a woman of questionable morals. Caleb Thorne himself was a phantom. He was gone before she woke, and returned long after her duties for the day were done. She would sometimes see him from a window, a powerful figure on his black stallion, directing his men with sharp, efficient gestures. They never spoke. He had made his offer, and she had accepted. The transaction was complete. He had provided the sanctuary, and she provided the labor. It was a cold, clean arrangement. Yet the house held his presence like a shroud. It was a deeply masculine space filled with dark wood, leather-bound books he likely never read, and the mounted heads of animals on the walls, their glass eyes staring down with vacant accusation. But there was another presence too, a ghost that lingered in the still, silent rooms, It was in the master suite, a wing of the house Elara was forbidden from entering, but had to clean once a week under Mrs. Gable's hawkish supervision. On a polished mahogany dresser, there was a silver-framed portrait of a woman. She was beautiful with pale skin, blonde hair swept up in an elegant style, and a smile that didn't quite reach her sad blue eyes. "That was Mrs. Thorne," Mrs. Gable said one afternoon, catching Elara staring at the photograph. The housekeeper's voice held a rare note of softness, a reverence that bordered on worship. "Lydia, she was a true lady, delicate, not suited for this harsh land." The implication was clear. "Unlike you." "What happened to her?" Elara asked, her voice quiet. "A fever took her last winter," Mrs. Gable said, her voice hardening again as she turned her gaze back to Elara. "Along with the baby." The word hung in the air between them, a pointed dart. "Some people just aren't strong enough to be mothers in this country. Now get back to your work. The silver needs polishing." The knowledge changed everything. Caleb Thorne wasn't just a widower. He was a man who had lost a wife and a child. His strange pragmatic offer to her suddenly took on a new, unsettling light. Was he simply trying to fill a void? Was she just a vessel, a means to replace what he had lost? The thought sent a chill down her spine. The baby inside her kicked a small, insistent flutter, and she felt a fierce wave of protectiveness. This child was hers, born of her own struggle, her own flight. It would never be a replacement for a ghost. One rainy afternoon, when Mrs. Gable was in town for supplies, and Caleb was out on the range, Elara found herself drawn back to the master suite. The door was for once unlocked. A sense of trespass warred with an overpowering curiosity. She pushed it open and slipped inside. The room was immaculate, preserved like a shrine. She ran a hand over the lace coverlet on the massive bed, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns. She looked at the portrait of Lydia Thorne again, at the sad, beautiful eyes. In a small, locked drawer of the nightstand, she noticed a glint of metal. A key had been left in the lock. Her heart pounded. This was a violation a step too far. But she couldn't stop herself. With trembling fingers, she turned the key and pulled the drawer open. Inside, nestled on a bit of velvet, was not jewelry or letters, but a single, tiny, knitted bootie. It was made of the finest, softest white wool, impossibly small. It was a relic of a future that had never come to pass. The sight of it, so full of lost hope, broke something in her. This cold, hard man, Caleb Thorne, had grieved. He had known a loss that mirrored the fear she carried every day. But then she saw what was underneath it. A small, leather-bound diary. Lydia's diary. Her hands shook as she lifted it. She knew she shouldn't. This was a desecration of a dead woman's memory. But the need to understand the man whose roof she lived under, the man who held her future in his hands, was too strong. She opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was faint, spidery. October 14th. The doctor says, "I am too weak. Caleb will not listen. He insists a Thorne heir must be strong from the womb. He pushes me, always pushes me. He says, this land demands strength, but I have none left to give. He sees a dynasty, a legacy. He does not see me. He does not see that his obsession with strength is a sickness that will kill us both. I am so cold, and I am so afraid." Elara snapped the book shut, her blood running cold. This wasn't a story of a tragic fever. It was a story of neglect, of a man whose ambition had blinded him to his own wife's suffering. The gilded cage was more of a prison than she had ever imagined. Caleb Thorne hadn't just lost a wife and child, he had perhaps been the cause of their deaths. Suddenly, the house felt suffocating, the silence filled with the echoes of Lydia's fear. She was living in a dead woman's home, sleeping under the roof of a man whose ambition was a destructive force, and she was carrying a child he had already taken an unnerving interest in. At dinner that evening, Caleb Thorne was present. It was a rare occurrence. He sat at the head of the long, polished table, and Elara, along with Mrs. Gable, ate at a smaller table in the corner of the dining room, as was the custom. The silence was thick and heavy. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Elara." She jumped, startled. He had never addressed her directly during a meal. "Yes, Mr. Thorne." His flinty eyes met hers across the room. "I trust the work is not too strenuous for you." "No, sir, it is fine," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her plate. "Good," he said. He took a sip of wine, then set the glass down with a decisive click. "I have been thinking. This arrangement is inefficient. A housekeeper carrying a child, a rancher without a wife. The town talks, tongues wag. It is unseemly." Mrs. Gable sat bolt upright, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Elara's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. She could feel the ghost of Lydia in the room whispering a warning. "A marriage would solve the problem," Caleb Thorne stated, as if discussing the purchase of new livestock. "It would give you security and a name for your child. It would give me a wife and put an end to the gossip. It is a practical solution for both of us." Elara stared at him, speechless. The food turned to ash in her mouth. This wasn't a proposal. It was a corporate merger. He wanted to acquire her, to put his brand on her and her child, to legitimize his household. She thought of Lydia's diary, of the woman who had withered under this man's cold pragmatism. "The child," he continued, his voice perfectly even, "will be raised as a thorn. It will want for nothing. It will be the heir to this ranch." There it was, the price, the true cost of her sanctuary. He didn't just want a wife, he wanted her baby. He wanted an heir to replace the one he'd lost, and he was offering to buy it with his name and his gold. Mrs. Gable let out a strangled gasp. "Mr. Thorne, you cannot be serious. This vagrant—" Caleb's eyes flashed, with a dangerous light, silencing the housekeeper instantly. His gaze returned to Elara, expectant, demanding. "Well, Elara, it is a logical proposition. Do you accept?" She was trapped. To refuse was to be cast out back to the dusty road, back to hauling water with a baby due any day. To accept was to hand her child's future and her own over to a man who saw them as assets. She thought of Silas, the devil she knew, and she looked at Caleb, the devil she was only just beginning to understand. With the ghost of Lydia Thorne whispering warnings in her ear, Elara met the cold, hard gaze of the rancher. Yes, she heard herself say the word, a death knell, for the freedom she had fought so hard to find. "I accept." The wedding was as stark and contractual as the proposal. It took place not in a church, but in the sterile office of the town magistrate in Redemption, the county seat. The only witnesses were the magistrate's board clerk and a visibly horrified Mrs. Gable, who looked as if she were attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Caleb stood stoic and impassive, his answers to the magistrate's questions short and clipped. Elara, dressed in a simple grey dress borrowed from Lydia Thorne's wardrobe, at Mrs. Gable's icy insistence, felt like a ghost inhabiting another woman's life. When the magistrate pronounced them man and wife, Caleb didn't kiss her. He simply shook the magistrate's hand, paid him a fee, and led her out to the wagon. She was no longer Elara, the hired help. She was Mrs. Caleb Thorne. The name felt heavy and false, a costume she wasn't sure how to wear. Life at Thorne Crest changed, yet it remained the same. She moved from the servants' quarters into the main house, but not into the master suite with Caleb. He had a guest room prepared for her, one that was comfortable and well-appointed, but pointedly separate. She was a wife in name, only a strategic partner in the business of his life. Her duties were lighter. Mrs. Gable was now forced to show her a grudging, resentful deference, but her days were filled with an unnerving emptiness. She was a queen in a gilded cage, with no power and no purpose beyond the baby growing within her. Caleb's interest in her pregnancy became more pronounced. He wasn't tender or affectionate, but clinical. He hired the doctor from Redemption to make weekly visits, ensuring her health was optimal. He had her diet overseen by Mrs. Gable, with specific instructions for more meat, more milk, more vegetables from the garden. He was not nurturing a wife, he was cultivating an heir. He would sometimes watch her from across a room, his gaze fixed on her belly, a look of intense, proprietary calculation in his eyes. It was the same look he gave his prize bulls. Elara found herself retreating further inward, her only comfort the steady rhythmic movements of the baby inside her. She spoke to the child in whispers when she was alone, telling it stories of a world far from the oppressive silence of the Thorne Ranch, of green fields, of flowing rivers, of a life where love was not a transaction. She held on to the memory of Silas's reported death like a talisman, the foundation upon which this strange new life was built. As long as he was gone, she could endure this. She could play the part of Mrs. Thorne long enough for her child to be born into security. Then she would figure out the rest. The first crack in that foundation appeared on a Tuesday. The mail buggy, a weekly connection to the outside world, delivered a small stack of letters and periodicals for Caleb. As Elara sorted through them on the hall table, a newspaper from St. Louis caught her eye. It was weeks old, used as wrapping for a parcel, but a headline on an inner page made her blood run cold. Infamous outlaw Silas the Charmer, Kane, escapes federal custody. 2 guards dead. The name was different, Silas Kane, but the moniker, the Charmer, was his, and the accompanying artist's sketch, though crude, was unmistakably the man she had married. The handsome face, the confident smirk, the dark, piercing eyes. He wasn't dead. He had never been hanged. The story she'd read, the one that had given her the courage to flee, had been wrong. Or perhaps it was a deliberate lie, planted by his associates. Silas was alive, and he was free. Elara stumbled back from the table, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. The room spun. He was alive. The monster from her past was not a ghost, but a living, breathing threat. A man who considered her his property, a man who would never ever let her go. And she was now married to another man, carrying a child he believed was his heir. The lie she had told Caleb Thorne was no longer a simple shield. It was a landmine. For days, she lived in a fog of pure terror. Every approaching rider, every distant shout, every slam of a door sent her heart into a frantic, panicked rhythm. She scanned the horizon constantly, imagining Silas's charismatic, deadly smile appearing over the crest of a hill. He would find her. She had no doubt of that. He was cunning and relentless. He would see her marriage to a wealthy rancher not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. He wouldn't just want her back. He would want everything Caleb Thorne owned. She considered telling Caleb the truth. The thought was terrifying. He was a man who valued logic, control, and above all strength. He had married her based on a lie. How would this cold, pragmatic man react to the news that his new wife was not a respectable widow, but the runaway spouse of a notorious escaped killer, and that the child he was grooming as his heir was the progeny of that same outlaw? He would cast her out without a second thought. He would see her as a liability, a contaminant in his carefully ordered world. She and her baby would be left with nothing, stranded in the wilderness with Silas hunting them. No, she couldn't tell him. The risk was too great. She had to find another way. Her chance, or what she perceived as one, came a week later. Caleb announced he would be gone for 3 days, riding to the northern pastures to oversee the summer roundup. It was the opening she needed. Her plan was desperate, half-formed, and foolish. She would take one of the horses, pack what little food she could smuggle from the kitchen, and ride east. She would disappear again, try to lose herself in the vastness of the country before Silas could track her to Thorne Crest. It was the same desperate flight she'd made once before, only this time she was heavier, slower, and the stakes were infinitely higher. The night before Caleb was to leave, Elara lay awake in her separate room, her mind racing. The house was tomb silent. She could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds to her departure or her doom. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. She froze, her entire body tensing. It was Caleb's heavy tread, but instead of going to his own room, the footsteps stopped outside her door. A soft knock. Elara's breath caught in her throat. He had never come to her room before. "Yes," she called out, her voice a trembling whisper. The door opened, and Caleb stood there, silhouetted by the moonlight from the hall window. He wasn't in his night clothes, but fully dressed, as if he'd just come in from outside. "I could not sleep," he said, his voice low. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, plunging them into near darkness. "The child, is it active?" The question was so unexpected, so strangely intimate, that it threw her off balance. "Yes," she managed. "It moves often at night." He walked slowly toward the bed. She could smell the scent of the cool night air on his clothes. He stopped beside her, a great dark shape in the gloom. "My wife, Lydia," he began, and the name hung between them, a ghost in its own right. She said it was like butterflies, the first movements. I never felt it. Elara didn't know what to say. This was the most personal he had ever been. She could feel the weight of his grief, a palpable thing in the small room. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough, with an emotion she couldn't name. She knew what he was asking. Before she could answer, before she could think, he reached out a hand, not to her belly, but to her own hand, which rested on the curve of her stomach. His fingers were calloused and warm, his touch surprisingly gentle as he laid his hand over hers. And then, as if on cue, the baby kicked a strong, definitive thump against their joined hands. A sharp intake of breath from Caleb. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated wonder. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, his hand covering hers as the baby moved again, a rolling, tumbling motion. For a long, silent moment, they were not a rancher and his contractual wife, but simply a man and a woman connected by the new life stirring between them. It was a moment of fragile, terrifying intimacy. The tenderness of this moment was what broke her. The realization that this cold, hard man was capable of such quiet awe, such profound longing, and it was all built on a lie that was about to bring a whirlwind of violence down on all of them. The secret was a cancer, and it was eating her alive. He finally pulled his hand away, the warmth lingering on her skin. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice back to its usual clipped tone, as if embarrassed by the display of emotion. He turned and walked to the door. "Caleb," she said the name, feeling strange on her lips. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. She had to tell him. She had to. Her plan to flee was a fantasy. She couldn't outrun a man like Silas, not in her condition. Her only hope, her only true shield, was the man whose name she now carried. A man who for one brief moment had looked at her child not as an heir, but as a miracle. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she prepared to confess everything. "My husband," she began, her voice cracking. "He didn't die in an accident. His name is Silas Kane, and he's alive." The silence that followed Elara's confession was absolute. It was heavier than the darkness, more suffocating than the summer heat. Caleb stood with his back to her, his hand frozen on the doorknob. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a painful thud in the terrible quiet. She had ignited the fuse. Now she could only wait for the explosion. When he finally turned, his face was a mask of stone in the moonlight. The brief flicker of warmth she had seen just moments before was gone, replaced by an icy fury that was more terrifying than any shouting rage. His eyes, those flinty, unreadable eyes, were narrowed into slits. "Say that again," he commanded, his voice lethally soft. "His name is Silas Kane," she repeated, forcing the words past the lump of fear in her throat. She told him everything, the words tumbling out in a desperate whispered torrent. The abusive marriage disguised by charm, the murder of the Pinkerton agent, her flight, the false news of his execution, and the headline she had seen in the St. Louis paper. "He's an escaped outlaw, and he's my husband. The baby is his." Each word was a hammer blow against the foundation of their arrangement. She was not a widow. She was a fugitive. The child was not a blank slate for the Thorne legacy, but the son or daughter of a killer. She had brought a world of trouble and deceit to his doorstep. Caleb walked slowly back toward the bed until he was looming over her. She flinched instinctively, drawing the covers up to her chin, but he made no move to touch her. He simply stared down at her, his expression one of utter contempt. "So you are not just a liar," he hissed, the words dripping with venom. "You are a fool. You ran from a wolf and led him straight to my door. You have made my ranch a target." "I was desperate," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. "I thought he was dead. I swear it." "Your desperation is no longer an excuse," he bit out. "It is a liability. You have endangered every soul on this ranch with your deception." He turned away from her, pacing the small room like a caged panther. "Silas Kane. I've heard the name. A snake-oil charmer with a fast gun and no conscience. He's wanted in 3 territories. He stopped and looked back at her, a new chilling thought dawning in his eyes. "He'll come for you, not because he loves you, but because you are his property, and now you are property that comes with a fortune." The raw, brutal truth of his words struck her harder than any physical blow. Caleb saw it all with perfect, cold clarity. Silas wouldn't just be reclaiming a wife, he'd be staging a takeover. "I was going to run," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Tonight. I was going to take a horse and you would have been dead or captured within a day," he interrupted coldly. "In your condition, you would have been signing your own death warrant and that of the child." He fell silent, his mind clearly working, calculating angles, assessing threats. The rancher, the strategist, was taking over. The brief moment of connection they had shared over the unborn child felt like a dream from another lifetime. "My trip is cancelled," he stated finally. "No one leaves the ranch. The outer patrols will be doubled. You will not leave this house. You will not speak of this to anyone, not even Mrs. Gable. Am I understood?" "Yes," she choked out. "This is no longer your problem to mismanage Elara," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He walked out of the room, closing the door with a soft final click that sounded like a prison gate locking into place. Elara curled into a ball, shaking with a toxic mixture of fear and a sliver of relief. He hadn't thrown her out. He was angry he despised her, but he wasn't casting her to the wolves. For reasons of his own, pride-possession strategy, he was choosing to face the threat. The devil was coming, and Caleb Thorne was preparing for war. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare of suspense. The Thorne Crest Ranch transformed into an armed camp. Men who were once cowboys now carried rifles as they rode the fence lines. A quiet, watchful tension settled over everything. Mrs. Gable, sensing the shift, but knowing nothing, grew even more suspicious and resentful of Elara, seeing her as the source of this unspoken trouble. Elara was a prisoner in the main house, her world shrinking to the view from her window. Every dust cloud on the horizon was Silas. Every shout was his arrival. The devil, however, did not arrive at the gates with guns blazing. Silas was far more clever than that. He arrived in the town of redemption. He didn't ride in like an outlaw, but like a gentleman. He took a room at the best hotel, dressed in a fine suit, and introduced himself as Silas Kane, a businessman from the East, looking for investment opportunities. He was charming, handsome, and generous, buying rounds of drinks at the saloon and speaking eloquently of progress and prosperity. Within a day, he had the town eating out of the palm of his hand. Word reached the ranch via a supply man. "There's a new fellow in town, Mr. Thorne, a real smooth talker named Kane, asking a lot of questions about the biggest landowners in the area." Caleb received the news with a grim stillness. "He's here," he said to Elara that evening. She had been summoned to his study, a room she had never entered before. It was lined with books and maps, the heart of his empire. "He's not making a direct assault. He's gathering intelligence, turning the town to his side before he makes a move." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her hands clenched together. "I am going to let him make the first move," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on a map of his property. "He'll expose his weakness." Silas made his move 3 days later. He rode out to the ranch, not with a posse, but alone. He trotted up the main drive on a fine grey mare, looking for all the world like a respectable neighbor paying a social call. Caleb met him on the porch, flanked by 2 of his most trusted foremen, both holding rifles. Elara watched from her window, her heart in her throat. Even from this distance, she could see the easy confidence in Silas's posture, the charismatic tilt of his head as he smiled up at Caleb. He looked exactly as she remembered a beautiful predator. "Mr. Thorne," Silas called out, his voice carrying on the still air as smooth as honey. "A pleasure to finally meet the king of this territory. My name is Silas Kane." "I know who you are," Caleb replied, his voice flat and hard. "State your business." Silas's smile widened. He swung down from his horse. "My business is of a personal nature. You see, I've come a long way looking for my wife, a lovely girl named Eliza. Imagine my surprise when I hear whispers that a woman matching her description, a pregnant woman, is living under your roof, going by the name Elara. He let the name hang in the air. Now I'm a reasonable man. I'm sure this is all a terrible misunderstanding. I'm sure a man of your standing wouldn't knowingly harbor another man's wife. It was a brilliant trap. He was playing this out in the open in front of Caleb's men. He was painting Caleb as a kidnapper, a man who had taken advantage of a lost, vulnerable woman. "The woman you speak of is my wife," Caleb stated, his voice ringing with authority. "She is Mrs. Thorne, and she is under my protection." Silas let out a theatrical sigh of disappointment. "Ah, so it is true. You've preyed upon her then. Lied to her, no doubt. My poor, sweet Eliza can be terribly naive." He looked past Caleb, his eyes scanning the windows of the house, and Elara shrank back, convinced he could see her. "Eliza, my love," he called out. "Don't be afraid. I've come to take you home." "She is home," Caleb said, taking a step forward. "And you are trespassing. I'm giving you 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride off my land before my men open fire." Silas's charming facade finally cracked. A flicker of cold, reptilian anger showed in his eyes. "This isn't over, Thorne. She is mine. The child she carries is mine. By law and by God. You can't hide behind your guns forever. The whole town knows I'm here now. They know I'm looking for my beloved stolen wife. Who do you think they'll side with? The grieving husband or the wealthy tyrant who holds her captive?" He had played his hand perfectly. He was turning public opinion into a weapon. "Get off my land," Caleb repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl. Silas held his gaze for a long moment, then a slow, venomous smile spread across his face. "As you wish. For now." He mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, tipped his hat in a gesture of pure mockery, and trotted back down the drive. The moment he was gone, Caleb turned and stormed into the house, his face a thundercloud. He found Elara in the hall, her face ashen. "He wants a war of opinion," Caleb snarled. "He will try to turn the law against me. He will try to get the sheriff to ride out here with a warrant for your return." "He'll succeed," Elara whispered. "He can make anyone believe anything." "Then we will not give him the chance," Caleb said, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive light she had never seen before. It wasn't about contracts or heirs anymore. It was about territory. Silas had challenged his authority, threatened his land, and laid claim to what was his. "He wants to prove you are his wife. Then we will give him a different story to contend with." He grabbed her arm, his grip firm, but not painful. "Come with me." He pulled her out onto the porch, into the harsh sunlight. "Saddle my horse," he bellowed to a ranch hand, "and a gentle mare for my wife." "What are you doing?" Elara cried, trying to pull away. "Silas thinks you are my prisoner," Caleb said, his face grim. "We are going to show him and the entire town of Redemption that you are not. We are going to show them a husband and wife. We are going to show them the Thornes." He was taking the fight to Silas, using the man's own weapons against him, public perception. He was forcing her into the role she had been playing, demanding she perform it on the most public stage imaginable. It was a terrifying, reckless gamble. And as she looked into Caleb Thorne's determined, blazing eyes, she realized he had no intention of losing. The ride into redemption was a terrifying performance. Elara sat atop a gentle mare, her back rigid, her hands clenched on the reins. Beside her, Caleb was a formidable presence on his black stallion. He had insisted she wear one of Lydia's finer dresses, a deep blue velvet that felt like a costume, making her an imposter in a dead woman's skin. They were a carefully crafted image of wealth and stability designed to shatter Silas's narrative of a kidnapped wife. The whispers of the townsfolk followed them like a trail of dust. As they rode down the main street, conversations ceased. People emerged from shops to stare their eyes, trying to peel back the layers of the drama. Caleb reined in his horse before the hotel where Silas was holding court on the veranda, flanked by the town sheriff Blevins and other prominent citizens. When he saw them, Silas's face broke into a sad, pitying smile. "Ah, Eliza, my love," he called out, his voice dripping with sorrow for the crowd. "He's forced you into this, hasn't he? Parading you around to support his lies. I will free you from this monster." Sheriff Blevins stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne, this man claims you're holding his wife against her will." Before Caleb could answer, Elara found a voice she didn't recognize as her own, clear and steady. "This man," she said, looking directly at Silas, "is a liar." A gasp went through the onlookers. Silas's smile faltered. "My name is Elara Thorne," she declared, her voice gaining strength. "I married my husband Caleb Thorne of my own free will. This man, Silas Kane, is a dangerous criminal wanted for murder in Missouri. Sheriff, I suggest you telegraph the U.S. Marshals in St. Louis and ask them about the outlaw who escaped their custody." The tables had turned. The townsfolk murmured, looking from Elara's resolute face to Silas's, where genuine rage now burned beneath the veneer. "She's been coerced," Silas spat. "She is my wife, Eliza Kane." "My wife's name is Elara," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He dismounted and walked to her horse. Under the gaze of the entire town, he did something he had never done. He reached up his hand, calloused and strong, and gently cupped her cheek. It was a gesture of ownership, but also of surprising tenderness. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice for her ears only. She nodded, her heart pounding. "Sheriff," Caleb said, turning to Blevins, his voice ringing with authority, "my wife has made an accusation. It is your duty to investigate it. Hold him. Wire the marshals. If you let a wanted murderer walk free to terrorize my wife, I will hold you personally responsible." The threat, backed by the full weight of Caleb's power, was clear. Sheriff Blevins looked from Caleb's thunderous face to Silas's mask of fury and made his choice. "Mr. Kane, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." The mask fell from Silas's face completely. "You will regret this, Eliza," he snarled, his eyes burning with hate. "You belong to me." His hand darted toward the gun under his jacket. He never cleared the leather. In a single, brutally efficient motion, Caleb drew his own revolver. He didn't fire. The heavy click of the hammer being cocked was a death sentence. "Try it." Caleb dared, his voice as cold as a grave. Silas froze. He saw Caleb's unwavering aim and knew he had lost. With a final venomous glare at Elara, he slowly raised his hands. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The performance was over, but something fundamental had shifted. He had protected her. She had trusted him. They had stood together and won. That night, a storm broke, lashing rain against the windows. The stress of the day caught up with Elara, and the first sharp pains of labor began. Mrs. Gable found her usual contempt replaced by alarm and human concern. She barked orders, sending for the doctor, her years of experience taking over. Caleb stood in the doorway, looking lost and helpless. All his power was useless against the primal force of birth. Hours later, as the storm subsided, Elara lay exhausted but victorious, holding a daughter. A tiny, perfect girl with a tuft of dark hair. Caleb entered the room hesitantly and came to the bedside. He looked down at the child, and the fierce proprietary look was gone, replaced by the same quiet awe she had seen once before. "We have a daughter," Elara whispered. "She is very small," he said, his voice rough. "She's a thorn," Elara replied, a small smile touching her lips. "I'm sure she'll be strong." He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the walls around him crumble. He saw not a liar, but the woman who had stood with him, the mother of his child. "Elara," he said, her real name. "The past, it does not matter. This is all that matters now." He reached out a finger and gently stroked the baby's cheek. "She needs a name." Elara looked at her daughter, a symbol of a new beginning, born from a storm. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." "Hope Thorne," Caleb nodded a slow, solemn agreement. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, she saw not a master, but a partner. The U.S. Marshals came for Silas a week later, but the threat was long gone. The gilded cage had become a fortress, and the fortress had improbably become a home. The marriage born of desperation was being reforged by shared danger and the profound miracle of a new life. In the heart of the West, a man who had lost everything and a woman who had nothing had found in each other a future. And so the story of Elara and Caleb Thorne comes to a close. It began with a desperate bargain in the dust of the Texas plains and became a testament to the fact that family isn't always born of love, but can be forged in the crucible of survival. They were two broken people who found an unexpected redemption, not in a perfect romance, but in a shared, hard-won peace. Theirs is a story of resilience, of the secrets we keep, and the surprising strength we find when we are finally forced to trust another. If this story of hardship drama and new beginnings moved you, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription ensures you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic lives and untold stories of the past. Thank you for listening.